Gustavo Ribeiro is a journalist and podcaster, and he joins us now from Sao Paulo. Gustavo Ribeiro, welcome. So Sao Paulo is a long way from Manaus in the middle of the Amazon, but what can you tell us about the situation there?
Well, Manaus last year was the first Brazilian city to collapse, to experience a healthcare collapse amid the first wave of coronavirus infections. And now is the first one to collapse once again. And like you said, hospitals do not have oxygen supplies anymore. Several dozen patients have died of asphyxiation. And federal prosecutors have opened an investigation to see how responsible, how accountable for these deaths the federal government is, because it was warned 1 week before the crisis peaked in Manaus, and it did nothing, and it has not presented the justification for not doing anything.
And is the situation so bad there that relatives are lining up with oxygen bottles to get them refilled so they can keep their relatives alive?
Yes, there are scenes of horror and desperation, and the thing is, local authorities have tried to implement some lockdown measures at the end of the year, but they were widely rejected by the business community in Manaus and by the federal government, which praised the governor's decision to backpedal and don't put in place any restriction whatsoever prior to the holiday season. The allies of President Jair Bolsonaro praised that it was a win for freedom and liberty. And now we are paying the price, not only in Manaus, but in several other regions in Brazil. The country has registered 4-digit death tolls per day for the past week. And we are now with almost 9 million confirmed infections and 215,000 deaths. And every single expert worth his salt will tell you that those numbers are highly underestimated, and that at least 5 times, we have at least 5 or 10 times more cases and deaths that we don't know about, because testing has never been widely implemented and the government has never invested in contact tracing for the past year.
Yeah. And how bad has the death toll been in Manaus and that region? Is it any worse than other parts of Brazil?
Well, the state of Amazonas, we gather data here more precisely on a state basis. Manaus is the capital city of the state of Amazonas. It's a huge state. It has the size of Mongolia, so you can have an idea. And since the beginning of the pandemic, the number of deaths has exceeded the average of the past 5 years by 53%. This is a data that has just been released yesterday. So it shows how big the impact has been there. And the thing is, the state of Amazonas, only Manaus has intensive care units. And like I said, it's a huge state. Sometimes you have to get on a boat for days, at least several hours, in order to get to Manaus. So healthcare infrastructure is very limited there. You have a lot of indigenous reserves that don't have enough sanitary conditions to weather the sanitary crisis on their own. And the government has been accused by several indigenous activists of simply abandoning those populations.
And what's the situation with the vaccine rollout through Brazil now? Has it started there?
Yes, on January the 17th, we started the first vaccinations. The federal regulators cleared the first 8 million doses for emergency use. But now we face a prospect of vaccine delays because there's simply not enough input for producing enough vaccines for the first stage of vaccination, which calls for 14 million jabs. We currently have the materials to produce 10 million. The government has tried to negotiate with China and India to get this input here, but for these past 2 years, President Jair Bolsonaro has led a very conflictuous diplomacy towards Beijing, and that has created some issues to get the necessary materials to Brazil. So we face a lot of uncertainty, and we really don't know how this rollout will be, but certainly it's on the road.
Yeah. Unfortunately, our link seems to be breaking up. I'll try one more question. We'll see how we go, Gustavo. But yeah, here in Australia, we're concentrating on the Pfizer and Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. I think it is. What's the strategy there in Brazil? Which vaccines are you rolling out there?
The federal government has a contract with AstraZeneca, but we don't have the inputs right now here. So the only vaccine that is being rolled out is the CoronaVac by the Chinese lab Sinovac. So far, that's the only one. We have advanced regulatory processes for other vaccines, but so far only these two have been cleared, and only the CoronaVac is ready for use in Brazil.
Yeah, and how effective is that?
Well, the latest trial data says that it's just above 50%, which is the bare minimum by the World Health Organization and federal regulations. It's 50.4% effective. It has, however, been highly effective against severe infections of COVID-19, and there were no deaths registered in the trial.
Yeah. And what's been the general attitude of the Brazilian president? I mean, here in Australia, we heard earlier in the pandemic him dismissing it as a little flu. How has his approach to the pandemic evolved over time, and has there been any backlash to his attitude there?
Well, President Jair Bolsonaro has been extremely consistent in his approach to the coronavirus, and that means belittling it and acting as an active agent of misinformation. He has been a sort of anti-vax activist. He has talked against buying vaccines. He even suggested to supporters that people would turn into crocodiles if they use the vaccine. And now that the first vaccines have been rolled out and public opinion is on the side of the politicians who championed the vaccines, the government is shifting its approach and trying to capitalize on vaccination efforts and try to gaslight the public, saying that they were always for the vaccine. There is a consensus in Brazil that if situation degrades, if the pandemic gets even more severe, if deaths skyrocket, and if the economy plummets again after a dreadful 2020, that will be a very dangerous cocktail for President Bolsonaro to remain in power.
Yeah. And taking into account his attitude through this pandemic, has his standing in the opinion polls plummeted over the past 12 months or not?
Well, that's complicated because Brazil is a very unequal country, and a lot of millions, tens of millions of people depend on government aid in order to survive. And that was even more so the case because of the pandemic, which nearly halted the informal economy, which is very much important in Brazil. So the government started a handout program for cash transfers, and that kept Bolsonaro's approval ratings very high. The main program, the main federal program, was halved in September and expired after December. And now we're seeing his approval rates eroding a lot, but he still manages to keep a very solid core of supporters of about 1/3 of the electorate, which is not necessarily very strong by comparisons to his predecessors, but may be good enough to avoid impeachment proceedings, for instance.
Yeah, but sounds similar to that kind of rusted-on support that we saw for Donald Trump in the US. OK, we'll have to leave it there. But Gustavo Ribeiro, thanks so much for it. Yeah, just really interesting hearing about how different countries around the world are dealing with this pandemic.
Thank you.